Thank you for downloading this RealAgriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
Good day and welcome to Wheat Beats Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, February the 21st. On this episode of the Word, sweet baby sweet. Dang it. More issues in agriculture. We'll try to give you a little background, a little bit of information around that. Hey, lots of questions coming in. That's cool. We'll try to address some of them. And at the end, I gotta talk corn. Because Tech Talk Tuesday last night, what a session. I'll summarize what I can. It's for those people that missed it. Just amazing amount of information there. Let's go. First up, yeah, baby, it is maple syrup time. In fact, I could have said this last week, and that is crazy early to have the sap running. The first week of February, people were tapping, they were getting a sap, and by the way, the sugar content, I'm told, is through the roof on that early run. That's way ahead of normal, and it's a warm winter. Bottom line, it's a warm winter. We only had one cold snap so far in January. When it warmed up in February, the sap started to run. You'd kind of scratch your head and say, does that mean the winter wheat broke dormancy? Yes, it's greened up as well. Yes, in fact, Dave Hooker's cover crop oats are growing new roots. So for sure, it's not dormant. Not that oats go dormant, but it suggests that things are definitely moving early. It's not just here. Mark from Delmarva, so that's Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, they normally, they're legislated actually. So Chesapeake Bay is a huge environmental concern there. They are legislated. No nitrogen fertilizer applied at all on anything until March the 1st. If you apply it before that, man, you get big fines. The wheat has greened up. It's already growing there. It needs that first shot of nitrogen. I mean, our nutrient uptake data would say once it greens up, we get close to that beginning of stem elongation. You have to have the big shot of nitrogen there. Yep. So they went to the legislature, and the powers that be, the politicians, agreed that the wheat needed that nitrogen. They moved that date from March 1st to February 15th for 2024, just a one-year blip. But nonetheless, that says it's warm. And so it's just a warm winter. By the way, lots of people suggesting, oh, Peter, it's a warm winter. Man, we got to be ready to plant corn the 1st of April or soybeans. Things are going to be early. Oh, you guys just make me laugh. Come on. No, there's no ice on the lakes. I get it. And that can have a bit of an effect. But at the end of the day, when we start planting, all comes down to rainfall. And if it turns wet in March and April, it'll be, late starting planting, despite the fact that the winter was warm. And we just hope like heck, and lots of people have said this, hope like heck, that we don't pay for all this warm weather in January and February when we get to April and May, because that is not where we'd like to be. Okay, enough on that. I want to move on, and yes, we are again fighting issues in agriculture. Dang it. So the Environmental Working Group published a study on chloromaclot chloride. I'm going to just refer to it as CCC because that's much easier to say than chloromaclot chloride. And CCC has been around forever. I think first registered in the UK and Europe somewhere in the early 1970s, used widely on wheat, barley, and oats in that part of the world because they get high yields, the big risk is lodging, and CCC stops lodging. In Canada, we now have it. It's called manipulator. In the United States, it's not registered except on ornamental crops. So it's not registered for use on wheat, barley, or oats. A few years ago, the USDA set some limits for products brought in that had been treated with CCC, and so the Environmental Working Group went out there and they said, man, I wonder if we can find that in people. They tested people's urine, and sure enough, they can find it. Now remember, they can find it. They also found that it was at higher levels in 2023 than it was in 2017 to 2022. But the gates didn't open up in 2022 for these products. It was actually, I think, 2019 or 2018 that happened. So is 2023 a blip? Or just why that is, we don't know exactly. But here's the crux of the issue. And you always have to remember, the dose makes the poison. And once we put something into the environment, and by the way, CCC can actually develop naturally. It can be naturally occurring. So it's not like it's only made synthetically. But regardless, once we put it in the environment, these days we can find it. You want to find, I don't know, Viagra in the water. My guess is you test the stream that some effluent has gone in out of a city, you probably can find it. It just, we're such good detection levels. So I come back to the dose makes the poison. In that report, it says that they found it, but they found the CCC at several orders of magnitude below the acceptable average daily intake. So we've had this discussion. 1 order of magnitude, if it's a problem at 1 order of magnitude would mean 0.1 is what you found it at. 2 orders of magnitude is 0.01. And don't forget that they said several, so that means at least 3. So now we're at 0.001. And the acceptable average daily intake, or the reference limits, are always set at least 1, if not 2 orders of magnitude below where they would actually think that the average individual could have a problem. So now I'm at 0.000001, and it's like, at that level, the risk of it causing an issue is just like very, 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 very small. So did they find it? Yes. Should we always be aware of things? Yes. Does it deserve the hue and cry that we're getting in the media? Probably not. It's just one of those things that I think is getting a bit blown out of proportion. And man, we get that quite a bit. On that note, Noah's saying, Peter, like agriculture always seems to get the bad rap. We take all the heat on greenhouse gas emissions. And by the way, Peter, could you do a special word on how greenhouse gas emissions work? Well, I don't know if I know enough to do a special word on greenhouse gas emissions. I may consider it. It's not a bad thought. But you can, if you're a computer person, Google it. There's lots of stuff on Google. But Noah, when you say ag gets the bad rap, man, ag doesn't get the bad rap. To be part of the oil and gas industry, be part of the automobile industry, like there's many other industries that get just as bad a rap and probably feel exactly like you. I think we always feel targeted because we hear the bad stuff about agriculture. Agriculture does have an impact on greenhouse gases, but we also produce lots of food, and there's many benefits. And if I do a special word on that, I will cover that as well. I've been covering that in many of my presentations, so perhaps people are already aware of that. But man, a 400% increase in food production on only 10% more land, which means we still have lots more forests than we would have since 1960. That's an incredible success story. Okay, I got to move on. Hey, for the people that are keen, go to the Crop Protection Network website. They have posted a list of the seed treatments that are on corn and soybeans, and it's really interesting stuff. I'm not going to talk a lot about it here, but man, read through that, because a lot of the actives that we would typically use as a foliar fungicide, they are now seed treatments, and some of the combinations are pretty cool. So have a look there, and it's always good to know what the heck is on your seed. Most of us don't read those seed tag labels. We should know what's there, and we should be looking at that from a resistance management strategy as well. So a great resource, that Crop Protection Network. Have a look there if you get it all. All right, let's go. I need to move into some of these questions. So first up, a caller saying, okay, Peter, you talked about spreading clover. Is it too early? Get out there and do it. And my neighbor and I were having a discussion, and it was, well, like, why don't we drill the clover into the wheat? And couldn't we even drill alfalfa into the wheat? And wouldn't we get better stands? So there has been a little bit of work done on that. In fact, Michigan State, I think way back, did a pilot project where they looked at drilling clover into the wheat stand. We do see a bit better establishment, but not as much as you would think if we get that clover spread early. If we do get late, then sometimes drilling it into the wheat can be better, but on average, it's not as big a gain as you might expect. And I think that's because if we spread it early, we get enough freeze-thaw actions that clover seed gets worked into the soil just a little bit, and it's a small seed. It doesn't want to be too deep. Be careful, if you're going to do it, run the drill at an angle or go across the rows, because the drill will do a bit of damage to the wheat. I hate damaging the wheat. But your other question about alfalfa, at the end of the day, alfalfa just doesn't take the competition from wheat. So whether you drill it or broadcast it into a wheat stand, a good winter wheat crop doesn't allow the alfalfa to establish, because alfalfa doesn't take competition nearly as well as red clover. Okay, Brad's saying, hey, I've got a Timothy crop. First, I'm going to take one cut, go to soybeans. How much nitrogen? It can't lodge. And so, Brad, that's a great question, and there's no easy answer. We do know that hay crops respond to nitrogen. This was seeded in September, so it's not maybe going to be quite as aggressive or quite as tolerant of nitrogen. You suggested 80 to 90 pounds. I sort of think that's in the game. It's probably a minimum. I might say even 100 pounds, but then how powerful is your ground makes a difference as well. If you've got really powerful ground, good silt loam soil that you've got manure on, boy, 50 or 60 pounds may be enough. Should you use a fungicide to keep it cleaner? Typically, if you harvest it early, that we don't see a ton of disease develop in that early forage crop. I wouldn't say that it couldn't help. It probably will help in terms of yield. We do see that, but the fungicide will need to be applied probably 3 weeks before harvest. So keep that in the back of your brain in order to give it enough time to do benefit. And most of the time, early harvested Timothy doesn't have a lot of disease to make it off color. But if you get delayed, that fungicide probably helps. And his last question was on established hay, what's the right time to soil test? So this is with any crop. It really comes down to be consistent in when you do it. It's not so much if there's a perfect time. It's that if you're going to do it always in June after first cut, do it in June after first cut. If you're going to do it in August after the wheat crop, do it in August after the wheat crop. So regardless of what crop you're talking about, it really is about consistency to get that best information. Hey, last week we talked about cardboard, sawdust, and straw. And I said, I don't even know what the seed-N ratio of cardboard was. I didn't take the time to do the Google search. And Murray fires back to me, man, Peter, the seed-N ratio of cardboard's 400 to 1. And I'm going, really? Like sawdust, we say, is 200 to 1. How could cardboard be worse? So I did the Google search, and Cornell University has a really nice fact sheet on it. Yes, the seed-N ratio of cardboard is 400 or very close to it. If it's corrugated cardboard, and why that would be different, I don't know, but that seed-N ratio is 563. That's incredible. If you're going to use corrugated cardboard to bed with, it's going to really tie up a lot of nitrogen when you go to grow that next crop. By the way, on that spreadsheet or on that fact sheet from Cornell, shavings or sawdust had a range from 200 to 750 for a carbon and nitrogen ratio. We typically say that sawdust shavings are 200 to 1, but it could be much higher than that. I found that interesting. And even wheat straw, which the typical number is 80 to 1, well, in that fact sheet, it's 100 to 150 with an average of 127 to 1, which is much higher than what we have generally talked about. And so I think that comes back to there's variability. You really want to know, you have to test. And so test your manure for that carbon to nitrogen ratio. We've talked about that before. But this base material, the difference is there. That just shows you how much difference you can get into. Hey, on that note, Tech Talk Tuesday last night. Like, oh my gosh. And Tony Vine, Dr. Tony Vine, retired from Purdue, grew up in Ontario, has moved back here. He was on Greg Stewart, my great friend, and Dale Cowan from Agris Co-op. Super discussion. Tony's saying that today's hybrids, the corn stover now has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than it used to. So we typically have said 55 to 1 for corn stover and 80 to 1 for wheat straw. Nowadays, that corn stover is closer to 70 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio, and that is because today's modern hybrids are much better of pulling the nitrogen out of the stalk and putting it into the grain, and they get more bushels per acre of yield per pound of nitrogen applied. And they do that by pulling it out of the stalk. So does that make a big difference? Well, if you're going to bed with corn stalks, yes. But the other place it makes a massive difference is if I'm growing corn following corn, grain corn following grain corn, and you all know I'm going to say don't do it. I mean, resistant rootworm, poor rotation, soil health, there's so many reasons not to do it, and yet I know people do it. But wow, what that says is that the corn calculator was developed when that corn stover ratio was more than 55 to 1, and Greg Stewart made the comment, if there's one place we find that the corn calculator, the Ontario Corn Nitrogen Calculator, that it shorts the corn crop on nitrogen, it's corn following corn. And so here's the reason that stover is now a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio. It takes an extra 20 or 30 pounds of nitrogen to break that down. And that is just incredibly interesting and helpful as we move forward for those people who, perish the thought, do grow corn after corn. Hey, so not only that on the corn front, but split nitrogen on a corn crop gives higher protein in the grain. And Tony said, but who cares? Because we don't get paid for nitrogen in the corn crop. But immediately, Brett's saying, wait a minute, I'm feeding hogs. So if I can get an additional 1%, and that was Tony's number, if you split apply, so instead of all upfront nitrogen, you split that nitrogen, you get more of the nitrogen in the plant from the fertilizer, and that ends up as higher protein in the grain. And I just step back and say, hey, that's a wheat thing, man. We know we split nitrogen. We get higher protein in the wheat crop. In fact, on hard red winter wheat, what do we want to do? We want to do an extra late application when proteins are low because that drives protein even higher. Well, apparently that works in corn as well. So from a livestock feeding standpoint, I think that's something to pay attention to. And the other thing that I found interesting was that in Tony's research, applying a fungicide improved the nitrogen use efficiency. It does that in wheat as well. We get more yield based on the same amount of nitrogen, but it also increased the protein in the grain. And I have to look at that and see if that happens in wheat as well. I think it does, but I have to go back to our data to see. But you want higher protein? Again, if you're feeding that crop, the fungicide actually adds to protein there as well. Hey, one last quick thing just on that Tech Talk Tuesday, because there's so much more there, but wow, cool stuff. But more benefit. So potash is really critical on a corn crop. We have talked about this. More important than even phosphorus. But in Tony's work, if you have a low soil test potash level, fall application is much better than spring application of the potash. And that, I had not heard that before. That is an interesting piece of information. It's sort of like, even if I put potash in the band, in the zone with a strip tiller, in a 2x2 band on the corn planter, if I have a low soil test potash, I can't get enough there, and I don't seem to be able to overcome the yield impact of that low potash the same way I can is if I go out and I broadcast that potash in the fall across the whole field. And so from a management standpoint, lots of times I get asked, fall potash, spring potash, which is better? And mostly that's a soybean question. And we mostly say, well, there's not a lot of difference, maybe a little bit of benefit to the fall, but on soybeans, because they seem to have shallower rooting systems, spring broadcast potash works. Well, on corn, spring broadcast potash does not work as well as fall. So that's something to tuck in the back of your brain. Okay, with that, I am out of time. That's it. That's all on behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture. This is Wheat Pete with the word for Wednesday, February the 21st. Hey, keep the questions and the comments coming. And Josh, I will email you back, and I'll talk about your question on nitrogen next week. See you then. Have a great one. Bye now.